What you've just painted to me is like a Karen, right?
A Bogenhauser Karen.
Hi, I'm Andy.
And I'm Roger.
And welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics
on our search to find the middle.
That's fatphobic.
I don't build wall. I just own halfway to Shiwa.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
I act as if God exists.
Put your masks on.
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words.
So, Roger, you're heading off on holidays. You all wrapped up?
Yeah, I'm all wrapped up now. So I'm feeling like I'm in that period where, you've left the office for the last time, but it hasn't sunk in yet. Speaking of wrapping up, do you ever check out those the Spotify Wrap where they summarize your year and all that kind of stuff? Did you look at your own?
Yeah, I just had one album on repeat earlier in the year, so it just had I'm in the top 0.01% of listeners from beginning of the year, and that was my number one song. What was yours?
The algorithm just never recovered from that.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it probably kept peppering it in my list. So the algorithm just reinforced what it thought was my because if I was listening to it a lot in January, it thought, oh, okay, so he likes this song, so we'll just feed it up to him for the rest of the year. And I'm too brainless to try and put new music on, so I just listen to the same song over and over all year.
Yeah, my algorithm's really crazy, right? Because it has all the music that I listen to, but then it also has obviously the kids, right? And then every now and then the Wiggles will come on, and it's really jarring. I was parking the car the other day, and I kind of pulled into a spot before I could see it, and the car next door was putting away a pram. And there's always that awkward thing where you're kind of rushing people putting away a pram or getting the kids in, and he kind of shot a look at me why would you choose this one? I'm struggling with the kids. And then the song changed on Spotify to the Wiggles, and it started blasting the Wiggles at him, and he just looked at me, shot a look at me, and he's like, yep, you're one of us. You're accepted. And all the hate just melted away from his face.
It makes me wonder, what 20, 30 years time will look like, and how algorithms will affect and impact music tastes and therefore music production. So I saw this thing the other day about how this guy went and looked at every single number one since 1950 or whatever, and did all this sort of data crunching on all the number one songs, and found there's been a massive drop off of popular music that has key changes in it. It's not that people don't like that feature, it's just that it's
just not served up to them.
Yeah, and what else is going to disappear?
There's that amazing scene in, I don't know whether you watch Mad Men, where he's obviously creating ads to influence people, and they hire in this consultancy that's looking at what people actually want and their the psychology of purchasing and thing. And he's giving this report to Don Draper, who's the ad man, and she says to him, "Oh, this is what people want, right? This is what their purchasing habits. This is what they're drawn to." And he turns around and says to them, "They don't know what they want because we haven't told them what they want yet." And I think that's kind of similar with advertising or the algorithm or all these influencing factors by the media. It's how much is fashion dictated by the choices that are served up to you?
I don't think it really is your choice, but I do think there's a difference between the curation of the best fashion or the best music or cinema or whatever. It's elite opinion and it's curated versus now where it's just the algorithm. And I suppose the risk is that you have a bit of a dumbing down of whatever it is. It's literally taking the most popular things and they're not necessarily that thoughtful, or the best things aren't necessarily what emerges. Again, it's that Idiocracy movie again.
I think the algorithm is obviously learning too, right? It's a form of AI, and it keeps on evolving, right? So the sophistication that they use to suggest artists that are similar is always getting better and better. And I think that eventually these algorithms will take on personalities of their own, so that they become broader and more inclusive.
Yeah, but it just depends. Is that how the algorithms are actually structured? Are they structured to do that? And I think I'm not sure they are. I think they're literally attention engines, right? Shorts and things on Facebook. How many hours you can sit there watching these 1 minute or 20-second things, and just how in the space of 20 years, cinema being this high art to now we're just watching cat videos on like on our
But
phones.
even with Reels and TikToks, it's really interesting, right? So you might be someone who is usually into social justice or social kind of themes on TikTok. And if that's what you look at, that's kind of eventually what you'll be served more and more of on Instagram. But then along comes some like truly clickbait, outrageous video, or like, someone half naked or someone falling off a bike or something, and you're drawn to it. Like right now, that will then obviously start to pepper in that content. But in the future, say they might know that, okay, there's a certain type of content that has a shock kind of value that you need to look at, even though you may not want to see it all the time. So it's marked that way. And actually they recognize that some people just can't scroll past certain things. But it doesn't mean you want to see all booty pics and all videos of people getting hit in the nuts. You still primarily have your core kind of content that you want. I can see it getting increasingly more complicated and more sophisticated like that.
In the context of like modern music, modern algorithms, Spotify, your year wrapped, that if like Beethoven never existed and suddenly the whole of the oeuvre of Beethoven, do you think Beethoven would make it to the top of the Spotify charts?
I don't know, but equally there could be someone even more impactful than Beethoven and you just never discovered or never even heard of because of the lack of technological communication algorithms serving it up. So I think that it's a long bow to draw around the benefits versus the negatives.
I think you're right. Pink Fong, Baby Shark probably never would have survived in the 70s and 80s. All right. So Roger, our last episode on race, I have some thoughts. I listened to it again. How about you?
I have a few things that I wanted to add in that I think we kind of ran out of time on, but I'll let you go first in terms of reflections. I know that, as someone of your background, you probably haven't had that many kind of talks, racism-based talks before.
I'll go through my shopping list rather than open up the can of worms on each. But I think for a conversation like that, there are a lot of minds in the field. So I'm still curious whether we stood on any of them. But I guess a couple of thoughts I had. One of the things we discussed was whether Australia was a racist country, right? And, I think we talked about that in the context of like the new wave of immigration, let's say post-Second World War,
Vietnam.
Asian immigration and so on. And then, the next wave with people from the Middle East and so on. But we didn't really talk about Indigenous Australia. And we didn't really unpack, from the perspective of Indigenous Australia, are we a racist country? And I sort of listened to it afterwards. I thought, did we ignore like a pretty core central part of our journey when it comes to race? The second item I had was, is it okay to laugh about race? Like we kind of did a few times, right? And I'm glad we did, because I think, we should be able to talk about these things in a kind of a relaxed way. Otherwise, it just becomes this like stifled conversation and not one that people particularly enjoy having. So I think the approach we took was fine, but I guess maybe more generally, did we give it the seriousness that it deserved in some parts? And then the final thought I had was maybe a question for you. We talked about, or at least you mentioned some personal experiences you and your family had with race. And and then I kept piping in saying, oh, well, yeah, but that was like 30 years ago, right? So I'm really interested maybe to hear whether you have any more contemporary experiences, like not 10 years ago, but like actually today.
Yeah, I mean, we can work through it. I mean, I'm actually more curious to say, well, it is quite a hard topic to have, especially when, we are different races. And I obviously have a lot more experience in being a minority, therefore can speak with more firsthand experiences. But I'm actually interested in how you felt talking about it. Did you feel comfortable? Did you feel like you had to defend yourself, but you wanted to defend yourself more, but you couldn't? And how did you kind of feel having the conversation?
I didn't actually feel inhibited or restrained at all. That said, I know there's lots of topics we didn't talk about because they are probably even too taboo for the middle. And I've sort of raised one of them again here earlier on Indigenous Australia.
Yeah.
And I guess to give an example of that, I know there are different views about things like acknowledgement of country, before a meeting. Like, I know that there are people with different views. Now, I'm not going to necessarily express a firm view myself. I think there's some very positive things about it. It's, first of all, it's probably the right thing to do to acknowledge and respect that there were people in the country before European settlers, and it's good to acknowledge that. And I particularly like the welcome to country ceremonies at key events where you actually have an Indigenous person with a connection to land educating and sharing a bit of their culture. But equally, I know that there are people who would say it is a bit over the top to have an acknowledgement of country at every single internal meeting we have in a corporate environment. There are people who would say that that's kind of just getting a little bit disingenuous.
Yeah.
And so anyway, but that's probably a taboo topic, actually, frankly, to have that open kind of conversation about something like that.
Well, I think so I'll kind of work my way through the list, and I'll kind of talk a little bit more about contemporary examples, of which I have a few as well. But I think the bit that I wanted to talk about was Indigenous Australians. And I think the biggest thing that I think we missed is the stolen generation and some of the policies in that part of our history. That is something that we probably should have called out. And for those listening that aren't familiar with the policy, pretty much between, 1910 to about the 70s, Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their families as a result of quite a number of government policies. And again, it's one of those situations where it was done and implemented under the guise of actually benefiting the First Nations people. And we're talking, this is all living memory. And I think the scars from that and just the egregious nature of what occurred under that policy, is probably worth calling out.
I mean, it's absolutely clearly a racist policy because it targeted Indigenous Australians. It sort of said your culture is wrong. So I guess at the other end of the spectrum, you have people with good intentions, but maybe misguided, and that didn't fully appreciate the consequences of their action. And that's why I think it was important that we did apologize to the stolen generation, just to give that recognition that it was the wrong thing to do. But equally, I don't think it was that they were evil. I think it was that they were misguided and irresponsible, perhaps.
I think this is a recurring theme when you intervene, even under the guise of doing good, this is exactly how the stolen generation was proposed. The intentions were good and did sound positive on paper, but it always ends wrong. And there are some rights that should never be broken. So have you heard of something called the Great Walk? The Premier of Victoria actually apologised for it. In the 1850s, in an effort to keep Chinese migrants out of Victoria, they essentially charged this incredibly high tax. And so pretty much to avoid the tax, the miners that were migrating from China had to disembark in Robe in South Australia, which is the neighbouring state. And then they marched hundreds of kilometres through the wilderness to the Victorian goldfields. So a lot of them died of starvation and exhaustion, and those who made it endured intense segregation and racism. And I think that it's something that we have to come to grips with. And I know, going back to our previous episode, there was that part where I kind of placed it on you and I asked you, can you see how there is some white privilege to acknowledge or some kind of acceptance for living in a society that has represented white Australian policies or had racist kind of policies. And I know that, you're reluctant to accept responsibility for that because of your personal heritage, but you can see how the minorities that are affected by this would be looking for that.
In my view, it's absurd to try and hold someone accountable for the action of a different person, right? You can only be responsible for your own actions, the things you did yourself. But that's not what you're asking. What you're asking is there a leg up, or is there this concept of white privilege? To what extent should a person who might be completely innocent, but nonetheless has been a beneficiary of, things that have happened, for example, getting a leg up in the labour market? You have an Anglo name. Employers, whether consciously or subconsciously, look at your application and they go, okay, yes, this person fits a certain image or a certain mental model of how they will perform in this job. So we'll give them an interview, but not the person with a foreign sounding name. It might have been born here and might be actually a better candidate, but they don't get called back for interview. So definitely we should all acknowledge our privileges in life. But what I would posit to you is that in some respects, we all have different types and forms of privilege, right? And if you look at where you are at in your life and you look at the things you have and you, let's say, give yourself a score out of 10. And if you say, all right, well, look, I'm pretty fortunate. I'm maybe an 8 out of 10. So, I'm doing pretty well. Now, whether you've scored 8 out of 10 because you've just ticked all the white European boxes and that's just helped you since the day you were born, or whether you've achieved that 8 out of 10 because you've just happened to have certain values instilled into you, like hard work ethic, or you just happen to be born a genius, right? Really super high IQ. You didn't earn your super high IQ. You're born with it. So there's all sorts of privileges that we all have. And if we want to design society, well, we don't want to give advantages to people that don't reflect underlying capability.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to come back to answer one of your questions. And I've got one last thing that I'll just mention, but we won't dive into. The example was, do we have something more contemporary? Because I think given the conversation and the length of it last week, I think we got up until high school where there was the chink thing, which I guess is like the N-word for Asians, right? But where we kind of didn't go in any real degree was, I guess, what would be called like microaggressions and other more subtle things that have started to creep into the vernacular around racism in general. And a lot of those microaggressions will maybe come out in more settings like the office and things like that. Now, I'll just kind of get it out of the way where I don't know what it is, but there's something about public transport. And I think it's because it's like the great congregation, in terms of a cross-section of society. Everyone's on the train and the bus and stuff. But I can say, without thinking too hard, I have half a dozen examples of incidents on public transport where there has been some kind of vile racial slur directed towards me. And this is going back probably as recent or when I used to take the train pre-COVID. And there'll be things like chink or go home. There was stuff around COVID as well that I experienced. I had a white woman kind of spit on the ground near me and tell me to get away from her. So all of those things, I think there's something about public transport that really brings out that. I don't know whether it's the people, or just the stress of public transport, where you have a cross-section of society that would normally be interacting with each other. But I can commonly say to you that is still a semi-regular occurrence.
Can I just go back to the public transport thing?
Yeah.
Have you've given some examples, like in my mind, like the picture that comes up, right, for the examples you gave, in my mind, like I've got this like druggo kind of skinny white person on heroin, right, who lives in public housing that just has no shame, and that's why they say that kind of stuff, right? Is it that, or are we talking about like actually normal, upstanding, kind of otherwise regular people?
If I had to give it a type, if I had to give like a police sketch of this type of woman, it would be a kind of country-looking female with dyed blonde hair, permy kind of ringlets, and has like a little rat face. So pretty much like what you described.
So now you're just being sexist.
But seriously, it's like there's something about the women preppy. Because maybe they realize that. So
like what you just painted to me is like a Karen, right?
Yeah, maybe like a bogan Karen,
a
Bogenhauser Karen. But they're not always like that. And I would say, just to be totally fair to like white blonde permed women, some people that are doing them are not white at all. Like, so it's like sometimes they're of Pacific Island. There's different races they get into it as well, like Indian women too sometimes. So it's not all the stereotypical stuff that you can see. But I'll tell you that if you type racist rant or attack on public transport into YouTube, you'll have pages to scroll through. And this is all recent stuff. So it's still out there. It's not a part of civilized society like it was back in the day, but it's something that most minorities do experience, especially if they're on public transport.
I guess one thing that we sort of disagreed about in the last episode was this idea of that, we could go back, right? So we've made some gains in terms of like some progress and maybe we're less racist than we were as a culture, society. And I would still be quite strongly of the view that this is like progress, right? And once you've made this progress, it's actually, you don't go back, because the natural state of affairs is to recognize that we're all the same, right? But I think you feel less certain about that. I think the reason we don't go backwards when we make progress of this kind is because we feel it in our hearts.
Are you feeling it in your heart, or are you just doing it because you're supposed to?
Well, I think people are feeling it in their hearts, like more. So today, people work with people from all manner of life. We're a globalized world. The more you intermingle with other people of different cultures and different backgrounds, it's hard. You don't just think, oh, well, I'm going to go back and be racist again. You'll always have that person on the train who will be despicable. And they'll always be there, even in the most enlightened times, because you'll have the extremes of the distribution. But to the question of like, what's the natural order of things? Is the natural order of things in a world where we're globalized and where we mix together and we're all from the same walk of life? Is the natural order to be at each other because of like the way we look? And I think no, it's not. It isn't. This is a one-way street. There's no going back once we become more enlightened.
Well, so Asian men have been emasculated for a very long period of time. And Chinese men don't do well through dating apps and are not seen as desirable partners and things like that. It's a myth about them having tiny dicks and shit like that. And I think that we didn't speak about that part. And I guess my question to you would be just to kind of take all of that content and put it into a more digestible question. Do you think it is racist to have a racial preference in your dating?
If you have on your Tinder platform no blacks, no Asians, no Middle Easterns, whatever, that's probably pretty racist, right? But I guess the question...
There's a filter for that anyway. You don't have to state it.
And this is where I think we've got to kind of get back to intentions and, like you don't control like what you're attracted to,
What's
right?
the intentions of a no Asian men policy?
Well, presumably if that policy exists, it's because they're not attracted to them, right? Now, I can't speak to why someone would or wouldn't be attracted.
You need to speak for yourself here, Andy. Why aren't you attracted to Asian men?
Asian men? Well, I kind of am, Roger. I noticed you're wearing a very revealing
my eyes are up here.
But like, yeah, if what we're talking about here is ultimately sexual preference, isn't the whole thing you can't control that?
That's very convenient for a pedophile.
Well, I maybe that's a future episode, but I guess
spraying all over here now. Race hits a bit different though, right?
Well, not necessarily. Like, just to kind of unpack this a little bit more deeply, there might be lots of things going on, right, beneath the surface that reflect racial biases of that person. So that person might hold certain views or have certain attitudes or have certain perceptions. They might think, Asians aren't cool or whatever. It's not aspirational enough for me, right? So that bit might be racist. But the actual preference, the actual like sexual preference, and it may not be sexual preference, it might be actually a partner preference, which is a different thing, I guess, potentially. So, I'm sure there's Asian women who end up with these big, fat, bald white guys. They're not physically attracted to them.
Their dating profile said Vin Diesel, but the reality is much worse.
But yeah, look, I guess I can imagine that it's just one aspect of the thing that people can be attracted to or not. And I guess you can challenge all of the factors going on in the brain that sort of precede the preference surfacing or whatever. But once it's surfaced, you can't, it is what it is, right? You can't really lay blame to that person for having a preference either way.
So is the summary of all that you actually don't think it's racist to have a racial sexual preference?
This is like a really fraught task. But if the question is in a vacuum, a person who is in every other way not racist, but yet they're happy to go for every other kind of visually looking person under the sun, except they're kind of not into people with black hair and black eyebrows and, whatever, right? Yeah. That's the thing that they're not into. And it's actually not even an Asian thing. It's just they don't like black features, right? Or that's not racist, right? But that's probably I've given the thought experiment, which is probably not the kinds of things you're talking about. Where
no, this one was meant to be a bit lighter.
Blatant
and I understand, but while you were kind of answering, I quickly typed in the porn trends for 2022, and where do you think, as just a not to get too seedy into the gutter, but where do you think ebony rates?
I think that's pretty high. I think
you reckon it's pretty high?
Yeah, I think there's a reasonable enough cohort that are into that.
Do you think Asian is higher or ebony is higher?
Are we talking about men or women?
This
So
is
we're talking about
well,
women looking at men, or women looking
this
at
is like the
straight.
Pornhub analytics for 2022.
I think Asian would feature higher than ebony.
Yeah, you are correct. Way higher. Asian is actually 5th highest of all search in 2022, although Japanese is the 2nd highest. So strong representation, fetishizing the Oriental females. I mean, there are some questionable categories up here. Actually, what do you think is the first, like the most searched?
COVID porn. The mask band.
I mean, I feel like I need to wash my face after looking at this this bar chart, to be honest. But the first one, actually, for 2022, the most searched porn type is hentai. Do you want me to just read the list to you?
Yeah, it's just like, bang, man.
All right, so in order here, we got hentai, Japanese, MILF, lesbian, pine, Asian, stepmom, anal, big ass, threesome, Latina, ebony, massage, big tits, anime, cream pie, gangbang, blowjob, public, BBC, amateur, cosplay, point of view, Indian, squirt, black, JOI, trans, lesbian, scissoring, and real amateur, homemade. That's the list for 2022.
Holy fuck.
That's your Spotify Wrapped right there. We can get into the real episode only 1 hour late.
Wokeness, right? What does being woke mean to you, Roger?
I think that the term for me, stay woke and all this kind of stuff, obviously has origins in the African American kind of culture, and this idea of being up to date on the racial injustices, which is quite funny, because when you hear of woke culture today, you think of real liberal, bleeding heart liberals and all this kind of stuff. But really, being woke is about actually the red pill, right? It's like about understanding the injustices that are happening, the systems that are working against you. What do you think it means?
Cultural. Yeah, well, so like this is cultural appropriation at its best, right? Where white people still like black culture, just like we did with the blues and rock and roll and
work for Led Zeppelin.
Look, I think the origin of the word woke is, as you say, I think from African American culture, but at the same time, the popularization of the term woke in like the last 5 to 10 years is really quite a separate phenomenon. And if it weren't the word woke, it would be, some other word that would have emerged to essentially capture the same thing. But what I think is most interesting and about the term woke is that both they're like, so let's say there's two sides, right? There's this cultural war, right? So you have left-wing liberals who sort of want to be really progressive on different issues, and then you have kind of on the other side like those who are a little bit disparaging of the various causes and the things that liberals want to be progressive about, and they both use the term, but those who would call themselves woke, they use it very much as a, look, see, I'm alert, I'm awake to all of these injustices and issues. Whereas woke is being used as a disparaging term on the right to describe the left. So people on the right would say, you're so woke, or why do you have to be so woke?
Well, I think it's funny with these different labels, no matter what the origin, there's almost like a cool kind of coolometer. Like, would you say that at the moment on that pendulum, is it cool to be called woke? And
not
I think
now.
The answer is no, right? It's used as more as a derogatory term currently.
Yeah, increasingly. That's the trend, right? But there would still be people who would say, yeah, like I'm woke, like, and they don't it, right? And indeed, the only reason it's emerged as a thing that people get slandered with is because there were people, and there are at some point who would have referred to them in that way to describe that they're a certain kind of person.
Trust white people to make something that was originally kind of cool and in the black culture really uncool very quickly. Like it's just like classic.
Yeah, I think with the term woke, there are other terms that I think are related. So political correctness is one that, I mean, that's what like I grew up understanding, like the idea of like, it's PC gone mad or whatever.
Yeah.
And then more recently, It's not quite the same thing, but it's sort of related, is this like concept of cancel culture.
Yeah, I think those are the three biggest, right? They're kind of all almost like a Venn diagram in some ways in terms of how they're used and the consequences and that kind of stuff. I mean, the PC police have been around forever, right? This is not something new. I think it goes back to what you spoke about really heavily in other episodes, which is it's about identity. Like woke is about, it's a way of life. It's a paradigm. It's a mentality that if you stay woke, you have, you know, your identity and your kind of pursuit in life is to always understand what those issues are. It's about awareness, right?
Yeah. So how are we using the term woke in this episode? How do we define the term for the purposes of this discussion?
I think for the purposes of this discussion, because we're going to have a look at either side and trying to find the middle of this, we're going to need to go broad. We're going to need to actually look at woke in terms of in the culture of woke, I suppose, rather than just what it kind of means to be aware and trying to kind of litigate what classifies as woke or not. I think we need to look at it from a cultural perspective.
Okay, so I think just to sort of, if I think I get you, is that you're saying we'll use the term woke, but really I think what we're referring to, or what we're talking about today, is a broader cultural subset of phenomena that, like, we're not taking a narrow definition of the term woke, and when we talk about woke people or woke culture or whatever, we're talking about a broader thing than just being woke.
I think so. So when you hear someone saying, I'm sick of all of this woke culture or wokeness is ruining everything, I think that's what we need to get to.
Okay, there are a lot of different kind of terms in this space. So
it's a whole nother language.
Yes, and you know, we're going to use a lot of different words. If there's something that you're not familiar with, pause and Google, I guess, is your friend. But we might do a little bit of a quiz here just to get some basic ideas. So the first is intersectionality.
Intersectionality is actually a pretty complex one. I think that it's used a lot, but I think the ideas around it are complex. It kind of refers to this idea that all social categorizations, whether it would be gender, race, class, things like that, can overlap. And as a result, the privilege and discrimination associated with each can be considered in a scale.
So a black transgendered person would face more challenges in their life than just a black person.
It's a way of layering different identities or different kind of backgrounds to create a very unique experience in the world, basically.
Yes, and everyone's different and has a unique experience because of their circumstances.
That's right.
Okay, next one, cancel culture.
Cancel culture, okay. Classic. Basically, this is the response to an action or some kind of stance that is seen as offensive or not sensitive to the work culture, and the result being that everyone goes after the perpetrator, ruins their career, takes away their privilege, and essentially removes them from power. Okay, political correctness.
So political correctness is conforming to an agreed limitation of language, of things we can say to ensure that we don't offend people of a particular background, or using certain words, avoiding ways of conversing to, I guess, really ensure that we're not offending certain groups, or saying things in an awkward way that might be seen as excluding, marginalizing, or insulting other groups of people.
Great. Whitewashing?
So this is where like white people are in like movies in black roles. Is that right?
It's like Robert Downey Jr. playing a black guy.
Yeah.
What's that movie?
Hey, he was pretty good. But no, wasn't he? He was an Australian playing a black guy.
And finally, safe space.
So safe space is an environment where you can expose yourself to that environment and know that you will not be challenged on the things that you may personally find offensive or against your sensibility. If
definitely not my family.
All right. So one of the things that's really interesting for me in this whole workspace is how you have all these really weird groupings and coalitions of people who are concerned about different aspects of woke culture, right? So you have academics who, on any other measure of where they sit politically, are actually progressive liberals. but are quite concerned with woke culture because they see it as undermining like the scientific method and Socratic dialogue and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And then you have, financially quite strong incentives to be a credible voice against political correctness and wokeness and all of that. We're deeply concerned about all of this. And we're not just right-wing crazy people. In fact, I challenge you to point to something about us that's, like the old left-right divide, that's like we're left-wing people, but we're concerned about this woke thing. And how, particularly in the new media space where you have like, it's like ironic we're on a podcast here today, but you have podcasts, you have YouTube, you have millions of dollars like Joe Rogan, like something like $50 million deals, right? So there's a lot of financial incentives to speak to that audience of people who are concerned about this stuff and do so in a way that gives sort of credibility to it. So what do you make of some of that stuff? Like where do you sit even on the issue, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's quite telling that the academics, like you said, who are quite liberal on a lot of fronts, a lot of them seem to unite around this. And I think actually it comes from a place where, as an academic, they care deeply about discourse. And they feel that this is something that is stifling discourse and is putting it into this space where you actually can't have a marketplace of ideas and discuss them in a way that moves us forward, which is really what academic institutions are meant to be, right? Whether it's through the scientific method or other more debate-driven discussions. There's been lots of examples where the conversation and discourse has been really stifled. So I think that's why they really care about that part. I think the bit that I'll throw in there too is I saw this big movement around this kind of, I guess I would call it the shame industrial complex, right? And so there's this lady called Justine Seiko. And so basically, she was just like an everyday person, right? She only had maybe 200 followers on Twitter. And she was leaving the UK or Heathrow, but she was going to Cape Town. And before that, she tweeted something insensitive, and I'll read it here so I don't get it wrong. Going to Africa, I hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding, I'm white. ! So obviously a racially insensitive joke, probably thought she was being quite funny. And basically then she went and boarded her flight, obviously lost reception. And while she was in the air, this tweet went absolutely viral and it was going crazy. People were going nuts. It eventually worked all the way around to her employer. And it was clear that by the time she was going to land, she was going to be totally cancelled. Lost her job, publicly known around the globe as a racist, all these things. And a really ugly side of public shaming started to come out from that.
When you see these examples, it's very energizing to be a voice against that sort of stuff, or to be like, oh, this is just ridiculous, right? Like the really, really egregious examples where they just look so silly in hindsight and from sort of a bird's eye view, like the view from Mars sort of thing, that you can kind of merge the line and the boundaries between the really obvious examples and the ones that maybe aren't actually quite as obvious. So let's imagine, for example, like completely different circumstances. Let's imagine she tweeted something like, the N-word, right? And then let's say some racists or people of a who have racial prejudices said, see, this is just cancel culture, right? This is woke culture gone mad, right?
Yeah.
But it's not so clear in that case, right? In fact, it's probably clear that, probably if someone's saying that probably they probably shouldn't have their job, right? Or you probably wouldn't want them representing you if you were their employer. So people are attracted to it, not just because, they do want to be the pious voice of reason, in the debate, but because it speaks to their own view that they and their views and their outlook on the world is being challenged by these unreasonable people, the mob, the left inner city woke elites, and I think that's why it's so appealing on the anti-woke side, because it kind of lets people feel better about themselves, because you've got some really good, quite out there examples of woke mobs gone mad, right?
Yeah, I think so. There's this thing that happens, I suppose, when you have someone like a Jordan Peterson or someone who has slightly nuanced views or is fighting against, I guess, this woke culture or this woke movement. They attract a lot of right-wing people. And he's just one example, but when they have these talks or they have representation at shows, I'm sure it does attract a lot of the more hardcore right-wing people that are dressing up some of their underlying prejudice and hiding behind that, right? So Trump's a really good example of that, I suppose, and where there are organizations that come into that they kind of hide behind some of that rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, we should say, like, with these people that you've mentioned, like, Joe Rogan or Jordan Peterson, just go to the top like 50 podcasts, right, and you'll see all the spokespeople. So I guess just to be clear, when just not saying anyone who listens to these sort of podcasts, hidden closet racist or whatever. It's just that there's something quite appealing about just saying, nah, fuck it, they're all wrong. We're right, actually, and we're this tribe, and we're right, and they're all wrong. And I guess the economics and the incentives are all there to incentivize people to play that role, to give people a sense that no, you're right to hold your views. Like you shouldn't change your views. Everyone else has gone a bit weird, right? But I guess on the flip side, right, the people who push this whole woke stuff, like what do you reckon about that? So the individuals who kind of really do want to change, and they are really quite activists.
Yeah.
They have an activist bent. Like they're not satisfied with the status quo, and like the people, for example, who don't want certain lines of inquiry to take place on a university campus, for example. Well, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that it's a tribal thing, and I guess I feel a little bit disconnected about the state of universities. I mean, you hear about how bad it's gotten, especially in the States, around these kind of woke epicenters, that they don't tolerate other conceptual ideas. And there's been lots of teachers and university faculty members that have been pretty much hung out to dry because of it. I think that it's a dangerous place to be. And I must admit, I don't quite understand where that's balanced out from a university point of view, right? Because all you hear about is these little epicenters of kind of wokeness in American colleges. Do you think it's really that bad?
Well, it's like anything. You hear the extremes, right? And then that's the thing that gives it, if you read the newspaper, you would think that the world is like this really evil, horrible place, right? But, the newspaper's only reporting on the most gory and exciting stories. So it's the same with this stuff, right? And I think, is it a thing in Australia? I guess is maybe a different question. I mean, I have no doubt that there's a culture of it, but I do think younger people aren't. Like, one thing that's changed from when, maybe you and I were at university to now is I think there was still a strong sense of like, be tough and engage with tough ideas and don't shy away from it and engage the debate and argue with someone and tell them why they're wrong. And whereas now it does seem to be, I think once the word safe space, started to creep into sort of university campuses, this idea, no, we don't talk about things that might offend someone. It's like, well, you're at university, like that's what you're supposed to do. Like that's if someone presents, let's say, an idea that's offensive, then your job as a university student is to be strong enough to beat them in the battle of ideas, right? And that's how you build critical inquiry, not by just shying away from it. And this whole work stuff does have a chilling effect on that process. And I think that's why academics are so, you have quite a few academics that are against it.
Which, like I said, we're stifling that discourse, right? But I think, on the flip side, right, to find this a little bit is, I think it is a good thing that younger people are more attuned to activism, because actually I think that when I look back at kind of when we were a bit younger, there were probably plenty of worthy causes for us to lend our minds to that we probably didn't go after, right? And I'm not saying that in a way to make us feel guilty or anything, but I think that there are plenty of things problems to be solved, right? And if it is a kind of general thing that younger people are getting a little bit more involved in activism, that can't be a bad thing.
Yeah, but
en masse.
I don't know though. I think that's only because it's cheaper to be an activist now. Like before, if you want, like when we were at uni, if you wanted to be an activist, you had to get the train into the city. You had to buy some cardboard from the news agency and get your Posca out and write some witty slogan and then go and march. And it required a bit of effort, right? Now it's just, you just post some vacuous line on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and you've done your thing, and your friends will see. But
what about the people who actually march?
Well, no, but back in the day, that's how you had to do it. And if people wanted to go and engage, like now it's just like, I don't know, maybe you could pull up some stats and you'd prove me wrong. But I think if we were to kind of chart, protests by size, and size of crowds and things, like let's say 2000, the year 2000 versus the year 20, or maybe COVID's not a good example, but yeah, just before COVID, for example, I don't think it's increased. I don't think people are more activists now than they were before. I just think they're keyboard warriors. It's so easy to write some vacuous statement on a keyboard, and that's why people do it. And it makes them feel good, and they get social credits with their friends and their peers.
Yeah, I would say so too. It's a jockeying for position, and I think it goes back to that shame thing too, right? Like they can use it as a weapon to shame others. People get pleasure out of. I've come across a few, ex-colleagues and things that are very, very active on social media. Every second post will be about this issue or rallying or raising this injustice, but it never really translated into discussions with myself or anything into the real world, which was always interesting. And I don't know whether it was because they felt like they couldn't connect on that, or it was just, like you said, something where they wanted to do as an online pursuit.
I think in some cases, when people get into these issues and these topics, when you can yourself sort of critically analyze the issue that they're actually talking about, often it's very clear that there's a degree of like people being misguided. It's not that you disagree with where they're coming from or they've got bad intentions and they're engaging in this in bad faith. It's not that, but it's more that they've got the wrong end of the stick. And, to give a practical example of this, it might be when someone says, oh, shame on Joe Biden for not providing more military support to Ukraine. Whereas there's a lot of 4D chess going on when it comes to these very complicated issues. It's not the best place to be getting on your soapbox and talking about complex issues where there are people they've got far more expertise and knowledge and whatever else and indeed resources of government looking into these issues that somehow you think you behind your keyboard know better than everyone else. So there's this degree of hubris that I think sometimes behind it.
Yeah, I agree. So I think misguided is a good word for it. I always kind of wonder about this though, because you always see online, it's always like a repost of something. There's always a sharing of a message, which really makes me wonder that there's this very small percentage of people pumping out this material and this collateral, and then a huge network of people who are just passing it on, trying to shine a light on it. And I always found that dynamic very interesting too. You don't see people kind of giving their own opinion and their own analysis. They're really just retweeting, resharing, reposting. And so it's this big kind of amplification process, which, like you said, is very easy. It's just, a few clicks and away you go. They're not even their own ideas on the situation.
Yeah. And actually, it's a costless exercise to do that. So what are you reckon about this idea of like toughness versus victimhood? Now it seems there is a pretty strong incentive nowadays to find the thing that you're a victim. Speak to the component of yourself that's been victimized, whether historically or whatever, versus a completely different mentality that I think used to be more prevalent, which was tough it out. I'm a tough person. I'm resilient. Whatever you throw at me, I'm going to bat it away. Because I think it's connected to wokeness, right? Because I think part of the concept of wokeness is actually a conversation with the community about ways in which people have been affected in the past, acknowledging past transgressions and disadvantages. And it doesn't sit consistently with this notion of being tough, right? So when we're at university, late teens and early 20s, the culture rewarded you for being tough. That's what gave you status among your peers. But now I think it's flipped to, it's like, no, you don't want to be tough. You actually want to be sensitive and you want to be alert to the plights of others. And you might even want to speak to your own victimhood or areas in which you've been disadvantaged. How do you think that affects like younger people who kind of enter this new culture of this new status game on campus or as a young person? And do you think it's good for us as a society going forward?
Yeah, and it's a common complaint, right? All the younger generations are soft. They have no grit. Look, I'll kind of take it from a recent topic around, say, racial issues, right? Because we just come from a racism slant. Can I say slant anymore?
I was just going to say no pun intended.
But being tough and gritting and kind of pushing through things, there's a balancing act there. It's like, are you taking that because of the power dynamic and you just have to get by, right? But like, as you said, it's an easy way for them to be part of the tribe and get those social credits. I don't think it's a good thing at all, though, to sit and wallow in your victimhood, right? Because I don't think it gives you the necessary resistance to overcome. And I think that's because that comes from the next step, right? The first stage of this is really identifying. To be woke, you have to be aware and identify the injustices. And you might start with yourself because it's close to home. But so that's the first step, right? Very important. The next step is the more important, which is actually, how do I then fight for change? How do I try to address the reasons why I've been victimized and then stop other people from experiencing the same situation?
Like, I think it's still better to, even for yourself, to kind of say, well, look, here are the cards I was dealt. To the extent that I can change any bad cards that I was dealt, so like I can change the world, like be a change agent, for the rest of society. Like if I can contribute to that, do it, like do what you can. But if you can't, like if you're dealt circumstances you can't remedy, I think it's better to just like try and be like, the tank that runs into the tree and plows the tree down, rather than, the cheap car that crumples up. I think it's better.
There's going to be plenty of trees. I think that's the important thing to know.
Resilience is a good thing, and we shouldn't necessarily see it as a bad thing just because it somehow like denies people's past kind of experiences.
Last week we talked about that teacher experience I had, having some being racist towards me when I was a child. If my son experienced that, I would see like toughness and grit with him actually kind of calling that out and addressing it, right? And I think that's very different from kind of identifying his disadvantage or weakness and then wallowing in that. I think actually calling that out is a sense of power. And that's where I think there is a bit of a upside to cancel culture in that way. You can think of it as cancel culture, but it's also a form of accountability for those that are in positions of power. So as long as it ends up with change. And that's probably a good segue into some of the darker side I see with corporations. We talked about virtue signaling, and I think that when you look at something, say like the Black Lives Matter movement, and how quickly some of big corporations like Nike and others got on the bandwagon to kind of say, we need to admit our racism, and America, we've got a problem, let's not beat around the bush. I think that it's an easy way for them to signal that, we're on board, we're woke, we're aligned with the values that we know that you want, but doing very little systemically to kind of make changes. So I think they recognize it. They also recognize it for what it is, just as some of the younger people do, which is, good value, low risk, high reward maneuvers to get these social credits.
Like they're the best virtue signalers, right?
Professionals.
Yeah, it's like when you see, an oil refinery advertise how wonderful as a company it is because it's changing, it's innovating services in the rainforest or something. It's like, I mean, I saw one of the. Did you see recently because the football World Cup's in Qatar, which is not known for its tolerance of gay people and different lifestyles, and you have all these brands who in other markets would advertise themselves as like we're like they have the rainbow or whatever on their brands or whatever, and then anyway, but they contrast those like the imaging of those brands in.
That shit don't play so well in Dixie.
Yeah, in Qatar, not so much. So, and they've called that out on social media. Yeah, I just see corporations as responding to the incentives.
So just a stone's throw away from corporations and responding to these kind of woke movements, but not really doing anything material to change structures or their overly Caucasian boards or whatever it is.
For what? But they can't. What's their through what means?
Well, they could.
How is Nike going to make Black Lives Matter?
No, but they could address other what you would refer to as systemic racism in their organization. Maybe that's a strong word, but say, for example, the Nike board is, at that time, 90% white, right? And they've actually released, like, there's not something I'm making up. They said, well, we actively are looking after black leaders.
Like, some of Nike's best-selling shoes are all black.
What do you mean all black?
Well, like the sneaker is black.
I don't see race.
I'm colorblind. They're all grey to me.
Yeah, they're all grey. But yeah, like that's what I mean. They're not actually changing their practices or the structure of their business. They're not putting their money where their mouth is.
Yeah,
in terms of some of
but they
these
can't,
issues.
and they're not set up to do that. I mean, they've got a board, they've got investors. We might like to think of ourselves as being in like this really ideal world where corporates care about sustainability and social issues, but no, they don't. They exist to deliver a return to investors, and if they don't do that, then
I
they
don't
won't
live in that
attract
fantasy.
investment.
But then they shouldn't be releasing these posts and getting on the bandwagon.
Well, no, because that's a way that they maximize shareholder value. Is if they buy into, if they virtue signal, they'll win over fans who get a warm and fuzzy feel. I don't want to sound like the person giving the big corporates like the free pass, but in this case, I actually think that's more a poor reflection on how idiotic consumers are than
I was
the
about to
corporates.
say, we're probably obviously as consumers not woke enough to understand what's going on to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the consumers who are buying into this stuff and creating the incentives for the corporates to do it, who in this case, the corporates have nothing to add, and it's easy for them to get away with it, and we're all the poorer for it.
So a stone's throw from this issue is probably something that's getting a lot of attention at the moment, which is, say, the Netflix woke agenda, and the fact that every time there's a recreation of a popular novel or some other kind of fictional text, that Netflix, Marvel, Disney, all these other producers choose to diversify and regender historical roles to make them much, much more diverse. So you've got things like the Black Little Mermaid, a female Batman, kind of LGBT actors and characters that were originally straight in their current text. What's your thought on this kind of phenomenon, and does it bother you?
I do not think Hamilton, the musical, would have worked with white rappers.
That was original, though. That was an original piece of art. I'm talking about...
Yeah, but Alexander
after
Hamilton
it has been recreated.
Was a white man from the 1800s.
I understand. But that was an original piece that Lin-Manuel created.
No, but it's a real... but he didn't...
Historical stuff.
No, it's a story that he created a musical with rap music, right? So, or R&B or whatever. So... Anyway, to answer in a different way, I would say if it's contrived and if it's all about setting the agenda of, oh no, we're like it's Miramax trying to forgive itself for Harvey Weinstein or whatever and redeem its brand or whatever, then maybe a little bit sort of skeptical. But let's say a black actor is
in whiteface.
Yeah, why not? Why not? Well, okay. What if there was a
Would that be racist?
A black James Bond, for example?
Yeah.
Would that it probably would irk some people, I think.
You mean like a black Duchess of Sussex?
Leave that for another episode, I think. But
I think the world's ready for a black James Bond, but I don't think it's ready for a female James Bond.
I think that would not work because James Bond is a misogynist, and it would.
Well, you could turn that around and just uses a bunch of dudes.
Yeah, but then it would just become a porno.
No, she'd have the strap on.
So,
but you know what I mean, right? So obviously, that example, right? There's
I'm all for it. I just think that's part of art and reimagining things for I suppose if maybe the only exception, if a director is so meticulous in recreating what it looked like in this particular location in the 1800s, for example, and they're so meticulous and they've invested millions of dollars to get the costume perfect, right? And they've invested all of this stuff to really put you in that world. I could imagine that there might be some eyebrows raised if there are kind of deliberately edgy sort of casting choices being made. But that's a pretty rare example, and I would see that no differently than, say, if, in say, Chinese cinema, they cast a white guy as Mao Zedong or something.
I know, or Johnny Depp playing an Indian or an Asian character being played by there's countless of whitewashing examples on the other side too. I don't like it when they do it just for the hell of it. I think it needs to add something to the art. And when they're recreating something, I think that homage can be handled and respected in different way. The original work can be respected in a way that's tasteful and a way that's not, like you said, contrived. And then on top of that, I don't want, if it works, it works. And I think I reflect on this, say, Kanye West's crazy comments at the moment, right? If he just put that shit to a beat and made it into an awesome song, people would swallow that pill because the artwork would be good. But if it's bad, right? Say what I don't like is, say, take something like Ghostbusters, the female edition of Ghostbusters. I love Ghostbusters. I grew up watching that movie, the original two, and yeah, I don't like being criticized as being sexist because I don't appreciate the new movie.
Well, that's a bit like your
Which-
question before about is it okay for a like not to be physically attracted to like someone of a certain you can't control that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting segue from sexual attractiveness into all female movies, but I can see where we're going here. But, like, it has to work. It has to be a good piece of art. It has to be entertaining. And if it doesn't work out, which sometimes it doesn't, a lot of movies don't work out, you can't always just play the sex card, right?
All right. So to get onto a final piece of this puzzle of wokeness is like speech, right? Freedom of speech it's a deeply held value for many people, and it would be seen as pivotal, a foundation stone of our modern society. And I think one of the big concerns or criticisms about wokeness or woke culture is it's this movement that's taking us in a different direction, which is no, you shouldn't have free speech. You should have to either curb the words you use and what you say, where you say it, how you say it, or equally, you should be compelled to use certain words. We've in the context of pronouns and things like that. What do you reckon about all of that?
So, I mean, sounds so contrived, but obviously I'm a big free speech advocate, right? Now, like,
Are you someone who goes to protest and march, or are you just a Twitter advocate?
Well, I only just created a Twitter account for our podcast, but yes, I am deeply involved in the marketplace of ideas now that Elon's bought it. I just think that when it comes to the concept of free speech, people talk about the balance and finding a place where, on one end you are using your free speech to incite violence or create harm, and on then the other end you're not expressing. You have to actually censor yourself, right? So I think that my kind of place in all of that is that free speech, if you are trying to protect free speech and advocate for it, you need to allow yourself as much offense. You need to get right up onto that side of the pendulum before inciting violence, right? And then even then, I think that needs to be taken in a very delicate way around your responsibility for other people's actions and all that kind of jazz. It is something that definitely does need to be protected in my mind. Where do you stand on the issue?
Oh, well, as a general comment, I don't think it's mutually exclusive to say that you support freedom of speech, but that you also agree that we should be civil to one another and we should, not be deliberately offensive or whatever. And we should be
time and place.
Should be respectful of one another. I do think, though, the moment people get told, no, you can't talk about these things because they are inappropriate or they are maybe offensive to people I think we should be able to create spaces, actually not safe spaces, but open spaces for free spaces, right?
Yeah.
And if you think you need a safe space because you're worried about what you might hear from someone else, then I think you're just making people like tread on eggshells around you, and probably means you're not getting, a very, your own experience is probably a little bit sheltered.
Yeah.
And you're not contributing to society yourself if you're being shielded from ideas just because they might offend you.
See, I think free speech is where your comment around toughness comes in, right? Like, if it is just speech, you should be able to endure that, even if it's something that could be offensive and all that kind of stuff, if it's in the right forum. There's this misconception that if we let, free speech run wild, people will just be saying anything and whenever. And it's just not true, because ultimately we are kind of pack animals, right? We know what it is to censor ourselves because, for example, around the family dinner table in front of your parents, you don't talk about the same things that you do with your mates than you do with your loved ones or whatever. So you know that there are consequences to your relationships by speaking a certain way. So I don't think we need a lesson in that. We already do that every day to try to maintain the relationships that are important to us. But having a place where you can have those conversations, I think, is important, right? In the right environment, the right channel.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, freedom of speech, and kind of using woke friendly language or whatever. This is kind of very heavily connected with cancel culture, right? If you don't speak in the right way, you'll get cancelled, or if you don't say the right things, you'll get cancelled, and you're out, you're frozen out, like your contribution to society ends. And that's not good, I don't think, because it's not good for two reasons. Reason number one, sometimes the people who get cancelled because they're not saying the things that, they're actually like the people who are pushing us to get better at our own view of and conceptions of the world, right? And they might be wrong, but they might not be wrong, or they might be challenging us to think a little bit more deeply about an issue or whatever, and might make us uncomfortable, but maybe that's like a public service. And I guess the second reason is because all we do is just encourage them to go to the fringe, and they lost to us. Like, you can't, if you think they're wrong, you can't engage with them. Like, you can't convince them that they're wrong. Like, you've dealt them out of society yourself. So and there's going to be more and more of these people, and they're going to speak to their own kind, and they're going to be in an echo chamber, and the ideas are just going to fester and grow and become even more extreme. So it's not good on those two counts for those two reasons.
You know what I think is a really important, when we talk about channels and open spaces for free speech, I think one of the most important avenues for that are comedy and comics. Because I think when you get to that really outrageous side of people saying things that potentially they don't mean, or half-formed ideas, or they're doing it for a laugh rather than a search of truth, comedy is in that space. And I believe it should be somewhat protected, right? When comics are kind of getting cancelled and all this business, I really think that that's a sign of the times, that the pendulum has swung way too far. They're people that are going after a laugh. They're not going after, inciting violence or trying to kind of change the system. In a lot of ways, they are performing for us, and it serves an important purpose.
I'm glad you raised comedy and comedians, because I think the role of a comedian and the job of a good comedian will see themselves in this way. They are essentially like hackers, right? And they've got a certain code that they're working in, and there's a certain subject that they're trying to hack into, and there's different ways in, right? And of course, the prize for them is a laugh, right? It's to get and
get that back door,
not just like a laugh, like a kind of a laugh of politeness, just, you made a joke, yes, that's funny, isn't it? But that laugh out loud, visceral, like the person laughing doesn't even, they're laughing before they even understand the joke, right? It's tapping into a part of their brain that they're not, it's a subconscious thing. And so the comedian is hacking the brain, and a skillful comedian will be able to read the audience and know the magic string of words and the setup and all of that will draw out those visceral laugh out loud moments. And this is why it's so silly to, like, comedians are saying the things that make the audience laugh. The comedians are not inventing the code. They're not projecting a view. The things they're saying, it's not even them saying it. It's just them trying to crack open the laugh from the coconut juice from the coconut.
They're holding a mirror up in a way too. Like,
well, yeah, exactly.
And I think that's the great thing. When you hear that joke, it kind of bypasses all the programming, all the work programming, and you're like, oh my God, yeah, actually, you know what? I find this ridiculous too. And now I feel like I have a place to laugh about it. Even if you know it's the right thing, you can still find something absurd. And I think comedians play a very, very important role. And that's why I feel like, why are we canceling comedians or getting them to censor themselves? Like, I think that shows you things have tipped too far.
Well, what you don't do is you don't get rid of the underlying prejudices that people who laugh at those jokes and then find them funny by getting rid of the jester who said the joke, right?
I think so. I think, but it is worth acknowledging that the reason why the average person kind of wants to attack the woke culture more and more is how kind of sanctimonious it is. This kind of, it comes from a place of, I'm doing more than you, I'm better than you, I'm more socially responsible than you. But really that projection doesn't really meet the result. And I think that's why people uniting amongst a common enemy, because no one likes to feel that way.
Yeah. So to wrap up this episode on wokeness, and it's a bit of a vague concept, so that's why it's been a pretty meandering episode, I think. But nonetheless, I think that we should avoid taking this too seriously and thinking this is this really big, great challenge of our times, because I'm not sure it is. I think sometimes we probably underestimate just how useful woke kind of ideas are, because at the end of the day, like, maybe we look at it through the Western lens and go, well, yeah, we've got too much wokeness here because we're chasing the next big thing and it's not there to be seen. But like, there are a lot of places on the planet that could do with a little bit more wokeness. And at the end of the day, like, if we feel like we're progressing as a society, it's the woke people of 100 years ago that or 200 years ago that abolished slavery, right? So it's not all bad, and I think there's a lot of kind of incentives to drum this up to be this thing that it isn't. So I don't think we should be alarmist about it. But equally, it is I think something you said, Roger, which was that it's just so some of the stuff you see so self-indulgent, right? So sanctimonious, that's the word. I really think if people can be conscious of that side of it and maybe avoid the worst of it and just stick to the good bits, which is trying to drive some change, draw attention, raise awareness of things, try and make the world a better place, then maybe the world would be a better place.
Yeah. One of the reasons it's been so wide is because it's a relatively new label that everyone's trying to decode, even though the themes have been there from a very long time. I agree with you that it shouldn't be taken too seriously. It's not a huge problem of our time, but I do think there is a slight danger that in the pursuit of progress and the way it's branded as wokeness, it gives a little bit of a crack in the door for, I suppose, racist or slightly inappropriate views to hide behind anti-wokeness, right? And I would feel like it's a missed opportunity if we don't allow the good parts of the woke culture, which is seeking out injustices, holding people accountable for what they say and they do when that has a real impact on others, because of this idea of, that's just woke, stop being silly, stop being so fragile. I actually think that progressiveness is a good part, and it'd be remiss of me not to say that on the back of the racism episode, where I think like you said, there is real progress in society, and we don't want to see that other element creeping back.
I heard you ended up getting the head.
Finally. I can't say that.
And that could